Hello and welcome back to the Sleep Like a Baby podcast. I'm your host Hannah and I'm an infant sleep consultant as well as a mum living and working in South East London. So today we are talking about all things food, the myths, the mistruths and the general misunderstandings that are out there about, do full tummies really make babies sleep through? Do you need to put cereal in their bottle to fill them up and make them sleep longer? And also, when should you worry? What are the red flags you should be looking out for? What's normal when it comes to introducing solid food and weaning and all of those things? Is it that you, do you need to stop offering bottles or breastfeeding in order to make your child eat more? If they eat more, will they sleep better? All of that good stuff. It's a real minefield out there. And that's why I'm just so thrilled that I got to have such a fantastic expert on today's episode. So without further ado, I think we should just get cracking and bring Stacey Zimmels on. Stacey is from Feed, Eat, Speak, and she does a brilliant job of introducing herself and her work background and her story of how she became who she is today. Just really, really grateful for her. If you want any more information about Stacey and her work and all the brilliant courses and webinars and free resources that she has on her website, it's at feedeatspeak.co.uk, and that's all linked in the show notes as well. She mentions a couple of really good blog posts that she's done as well, and they're all in the links in the show notes. And yeah, thanks very much for listening, and here we go. The Sleep Like a Baby podcast is supported by The Octopus Club, the online marketplace where you can buy, sell and give away baby and kids stuff without any hassle. If your home is piling up with toys, clothes and bits of kit that your little one no longer uses, The Octopus Club offers an easy, environmentally friendly way of selling or donating things to other families. And if you're on the hunt for high quality second-hand goods, this is the place for you. Honestly, the stuff on there is gorgeous. Check them out on Instagram or go straight to their website, theoctopusclub.com, to sign up today. Stacey, thank you so much for being here today. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. A little bit hot. It's very warm, isn't it?
It's very
on this day. But otherwise, I'm good, thank you. And thanks for having me.
No, I'm so excited to talk about this and pick your brain, because obviously you've got 20 plus years experience working in the field now. So tell us, for people who haven't come across you before, can you tell us a little bit about you and your work and what you do?
Sure. So my name's Stacey, and I am trained and qualified as a speech and language therapist. But within that field, few of us, specialise in feeding and swallowing, so how you use the muscles of the mouth and the throat for eating and drinking, and like I said, less of us in children. So my area of specialism within speech therapy is in feeding and swallowing and little ones, and I've been doing that for about 20 years as well. And then more recently, after having my own, I decided to qualify as a lactation consultant, and I use that quite a lot within my work as a feeding specialist speech therapist. So everything I talk about is around feeding little people all the way through, including like children and babies with specific feeding difficulties, but also obviously knowing and understanding what's normal, which is more about what we're going to be talking about today. So that's me.
Amazing. So interesting. One of the things I wanted to really talk about today was unpicking a lot of the myths. And as we were just saying before we started recording, we live in this amazing age of information and social media, and there's lots of there are amazing resources out there, but there's also a lot of noise and a lot of misinformation that gets spread as a result. And sometimes that can, especially if you're a new parent, like lead to quite a lot of anxiety around food and milk and all of that stuff. And yeah, you must see that all the time.
Yeah, I saw it when I had my own babies. And actually, I've got quite a large sort of community on social media on my account, Feed, Eat, Speak. And that whole page just came from me sort of scouring the internet myself for information and then coming across a lot of nonsense about feeding
Yeah.
and thinking I could do better than this. I could tell people like what's right and what's true about feeding, and I could be really, supportive to everybody rather than like just that group of people or just that group of people that align to my views. And so actually my whole internet and social media presence was born actually from a place of being like, who said that? What? That's such rubbish. So yeah, I'm happy to be, I guess, out here and being invited into podcasts like this to talk about feeding, from a place of knowledge and experience and expertise.
And obviously, I'm a sleep person, so I see a lot of, and I was told a lot of this myself as a new mum before I got into this job, anyway, of being told, definitely between 4 and 6 months, being told constantly that the reason that my son wasn't sleeping through the night yet was because he just needed some cereal at bedtime, or put a bit of rice milk in a bottle, or breastfeeding was the problem, all of those things. And actually, I really held on for this 6-month miracle moment when he was going to have, I don't know what I was expecting, him to sit down and have a roast dinner and sleep through the night suddenly.
Yeah,
and everyone told me that.
Good luck with that.
Yes,
I know. I mean, I was in exactly the same, situation. And actually, I'm happy to share my story here. I think I've shared it on social media, but knowing everything I knew, I was in the absolute depths of sleep deprivation when my baby was about 5.5 months. She was waking hourly, I would say, through the night with co-sleeping. It was brutal. And everyone was telling me, just give us some food. And I actually knew that food wasn't going to sort this out. And I also knew that she wasn't ready for solids. And you know what? 5.5 months, I caved in and I started solids. And, I don't have a lot of regrets, but that is one that stays with me forever, for just not trusting my intuition. But then I think actually, how can you, when you're feeling so depleted and so vulnerable and so desperate, really, sleep's just, I don't know how you do what you do, but you must help so many families because it's so hard when you're not sleeping. So yeah, if professionals like us can sort of feel that feeling or feel that pressure as first-time parents, everybody's out there doing that. And some of the problem is that, some children might start solids and might end up sleeping a bit better, and it might have something to do with the solids. It might have nothing to do with the solids at all. They might just be ready. That's more likely to be the case. But the vast majority, it's not going to make any difference. So it certainly didn't for me. And I just ended up feeling like guilt-ridden and, regretful and more burdened, because now I had to do the solid thing instead of just putting the baby on the boob. And I still wasn't sleeping. so yeah.
I know. I remember a week into solids thinking, why was I so impatient? This is so much more work, and I'm soon going to have to do it 3 times a day. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, I remember my mum saying with her 4th child, she just delayed it as much as she could.
Possible,
and I think she said my sister must have been about 7 months and just grabbing food. And she was like, "Oh, fine, you can have it."
I was not dissimilar with my son. He was definitely closer to 6.5, maybe 7, and closer to something like 9 months before I even did 3 meals. Because I was following his lead this time, and that was so much more pleasant for all of us. So yeah, definitely. And one of the things people don't talk about in terms of, you were saying about myths around introducing solids to help with sleep, is that sometimes solids can disrupt sleep, especially if you go quite quick and you go quite fast, and their whole little belly, their guts and their digestive system, especially if they've been exclusively breastfed, I think more so, not, but babies who've been on formula, but all that food in their tummies, they're not used to it, and it can really affect their pooing, and they're wanting to poo and waking up in the night to poo and all that sort of thing can actually make it worse. So going slowly at your baby's pace can help avoid any disasters with sleep.
Yeah, definitely. And I certainly come across a lot of people who then, because they're hoping it will help with sleep, will start with dinner time, for example, as the first meal. And then you are giving this little baby at 5.5, 6 months, this new thing, and it's their tummies are upset and they're uncomfortable, or they're, like you say, they're pooing, and it gets quite stressful, and it's hard. Yeah. It's hard to know what the right thing to do is there, especially if everyone around you or someone you really trust is saying, just fill them up and they'll sleep.
Yeah, that is really difficult. I mean, it's not a surprise that I'm going to say, as a feeding therapist, feeding specialist, that if you can follow your baby's lead in every way when it comes to introducing solids, and that includes the volumes that they take, and their responses to the whole experience, and you go out there in their pace and you take it easy, then you're most likely to sort of have slightly better outcomes and navigate some of the sort of pitfalls around, filling babies up, etc. I mean, that's the bottom line advice, really.
So what are the main signs of readiness for solids then, that people should be aware of?
Yeah. So it's worth just touching base on the current guidelines. So the current guidelines in the UK and the WHO, which is the World Health Organization guidelines, are currently that you should introduce solids at around 6 months. So that might mean that your baby is a little bit earlier than 6 months, and it might mean that your baby is a little bit older than 6 months, even sometimes closer to 7. So it's because they all develop at different stages and different rates. There's a few key sort of milestones that are definite, sort of wait until, if you can, your baby is showing this. And there are always outliers. So if your baby's born very preterm, they might not have exactly all of those skills. They might need some modifications, showing some, not others, or other reasons. But broadly speaking, you should wait till your baby is able to sit upright and hold their head upright. And I would say, if you're going to give them finger foods, that's like properly sitting, like they're not going to fall over if you leave them, if they're having finger foods. If they're not, yes, they could be sitting, and the high chair could be helping them a little bit. That's fine. The second one is that they should be able to reach out, pick up an object, lift it up, take it to their mouth. And then the third one is that this is where it gets like a bit technical, but that when you give them the food, they should be able to swallow more of the food than they actually push or spit out with their tongue. So there is a reflex called the tongue thrust reflex, which is designed to protect little babies, from swallowing foreign objects, so that if anything comes towards their mouth that isn't the breast or a teat, they will stick or protrude the tongue forward to expel it. Now that starts to gradually diminish from around 4 months through 6 months and a little bit further on. So you're not expecting it to disappear overnight the day they turn 6 months. It's very gradual. So some babies will have it while they're weaning, and it'll be really prominent, and it's not helpful, nothing's going in. That's when you know to wait. Other babies might have it on the odd swallow, but most of it's going down. That's fine. You can continue. Some won't have it at all at 6 months, and that's also, all of those things are normal. So they are 3. Watching you eat isn't one. Waking up more overnight isn't one. Drinking more milk isn't one. Drinking less milk isn't one. These are not established weaning readiness signs. So the 3 that I mentioned are the 3 to note.
Yeah, I hear that a lot, is that that interest in food is often touted as a sign of readiness, but I think babies are interested in lots of things. Like, the world is interesting.
Exactly. I mean, they watch you smoke a cigarette. Doesn't mean you should give them one, does it? Exactly. Like, they're sociable characters, they're sociable beings, and actually one of the best strategies to support weaning is to eat with your baby, because they watch you do it and they imitate you, and they trust these things that you're lifting up and putting into your mouth, that they can do the same thing. So that interest is there, and it's there before 6 months. So for sure, it's a helpful and a benefit to solids, but it's not a sign that they're ready for them.
Yeah. And I suppose one of the reasons there's a lot of confusion about when to start solids, though, is that the guidelines changed. It was about 20 years ago or so.
Yeah, it's actually like a long time ago. But from a generation point of view, it was less than a generation, or coming up to a generation, which basically means that all adults now that are having babies, or most adults, were weaned at 4 months, which means that most of our parents knew that to be true, knew that to be not harmful, in inverted commas, to us. And therefore, that's where a lot of the sort of confusion still may come from. Yeah.
And some countries will still have that approach. Is that right? Or some cultures that's kind of more normal? Or do you feel there's more of a move towards 6 months? Because obviously with the World Health Organization.
I think because the WHO recommendations are 6 months, I think one of the tricky things at the moment, and you may well be reading lots in the press around, is around allergies. And so there's quite significant evidence coming through multiple studies internationally that if you introduce allergic foods, so foods that a child or a baby may be more likely to be allergic to early, it will and can reduce the likelihood of them developing an allergy to the food. But the key thing is, for the general population, early is at 6 months. And it's only for very, very specific groups that they're talking about below 6 months. And even for those groups, they're not talking, or they shouldn't be talking, about weaning. They should be talking about tiny, tiny dabs and drops of these allergen foods on the tip of the tongue, and only these foods. But because the guidelines haven't changed, certainly in the UK, they have in other countries, but in the UK, I certainly, in my practice, I'm hearing and seeing lots of different babies for lots of different reasons being given advice to wean from 4 months, which is to start all solids on the basis of allergy prevention. And that's really, really tricky, because lots of babies are being diagnosed with things like cow's milk protein allergy, and that's the pandemic there of sort of overdiagnosis to start with. And and then if those babies are then being told to wean early, that's not really necessarily the high risk group. And so, you get into these sort of muddy waters, and then the more families that are starting solids that early, the more the messaging might be coming through that actually you do start solids, or you can start solids, excuse me, I'm gonna
bless you.
I'm gonna sneeze again. There might be a third one coming, at or from 4 months. So just to clarify, that's a very specific group, from an allergy consultant or pediatrician, and it shouldn't necessarily be weaning. It might be just taste.
Yeah, that's really good to know, because I think, there is a lot of information out there about missing, or I guess very overgeneralized advice about allergies, and people get anxious and nervous, and then they hear
exactly.
So what are the risks of early introduction of solids, say between from say like 3-4 months, and why did it change?
So I think you're looking at what we now understand to be quite significant benefits of exclusive breastfeeding for 6 months in terms of the gut and the gut microbiome. I'd like to think it takes into account baby's development, but I'm not sure how much it does, because I don't think there's a sort of money going in to fund that sort of research. But certainly with a feeding therapy hat on, babies ultimately will wean better when they're ready. That's the bottom line. And so very, very, very few babies are ready to independently eat at that age. And so it's very much something that needs to be done to them and done for them. And that doesn't benefit them in terms of their development. And it certainly doesn't offer advantages that perhaps they had in the past thought it did, in terms of like the gut, for example. So yeah, I think that it's on that basis. There's a really good report from SACN, the Scientific Advisory Committee for Nutrition. It's quite a few years old now, actually, but that sort of goes through why they've continued to stick with the 6-month recommendations, if anyone's interested in reading it.
Oh, I'm such a geek about this stuff. I find it so interesting. I'm interested in that. But I think it's interesting that you mentioned that overdiagnosis of cow's milk protein allergy, and perhaps there is also sort of an over medicalization of things like reflux or other sort of feeding issues in early age, and there's not always a holistic view about what is happening for that child. Is that your feeling?
Yeah, I mean, I think our colleagues our medical colleagues like GPs and pediatricians, they're not, well, certainly GPs are generalists, not specialists. And
Mm-hmm.
even our specialist colleagues in pediatrics, they have very little training on feeding in general. And I think it's seen as fairly benign sometimes to just suggest as an intervention to start solids as a treatment. But actually, it's based on the hypothesis, for example, like reflux, that if you start solids, that, it will help keep the food down, or the milk down, and displace some of the milk. But there's a lot of challenges in itself with that. And, babies with reflux may well actually have other allergies. So then you're introducing certain foods to them, which their bodies may struggle with, which may make reflux worse. You then have to encounter or factor in that they may be quite sensitive feeders to start with because the feeding's been uncomfortable. And now you're going to wean them in a way that they're not in control of how they're being fed. Whereas, so that in itself can be challenging. And then, so again, you're sometimes creating, a secondary issue. And I think it's coming from a place of really just not necessarily thinking that through or understanding the impact of that decision making, or perhaps not even following up these babies to know that it was or wasn't beneficial. And again, if you ask on parenting forums, there'll be lots of parents, I'm sure, who swear by solids at 17, 20 weeks or whatever, really helping with their child's reflux. And I don't dispute that that's the case. But there are many for whom it doesn't, and there will be a proportion for whom it actually might make things worse. And we also, nobody's looking at the long-term impact of what that might be doing to the gut or the microbiome of the baby who could have been exclusively breastfed, for example, for 6 months, and actually who was only exclusively breastfed for 4 months as a result of early weaning. And that information is just not available to us. But we understand that there will be consequences to that from a long-term health perspective. So again, it's like, it's important to just look at the whole picture and look at, what science and evidence we have behind some of these recommendations, and use your gut feeling as well, like about your own baby. And if you believe or think that they might be ready to take on that task and developmentally sort of thrive with the introduction of solids, which they should, because it should be really good fun for them to get stuck right in.
Yeah, but I do think there is something about that 4-5 month period that can just be so difficult, and behaviors can change, and you're coming out of that sort of sleepy, milky newborn phase. Your baby's doing more. There's all of this gross motor skills, fine motor skills, all of this stuff happening, disrupting sleep, maybe increasing feeds, all of these things, and it's so easy to think, yeah, or that must be the fix.
Maybe that will help.
Yeah.
And if no one was talking about it and everyone had just accepted that we start solids around 6 months, then it probably wouldn't cross your mind. But like you said right at the beginning, like everybody's got an opinion on it, and everybody, in every family or in every friendship group or in every online forum, there will be, at least 10% of people being like, no, it's absolutely fine, just start solids. And it's really, really hard to navigate that. Ultimately, and if you have started solids early, and you, like me, a little bit earlier than you wanted, or a lot earlier than you had planned, it is what it is. I don't want anyone to be listening to this and feeling that, bad or guilty, or that they've harmed their little ones. I mean, at the end of the day, all our babies will thrive with our love and with the nutritious foods that we provide them with, and the milk that we give them. And we're all just trying to do our best. That's all, and that's all we can do, can't we?
Yeah, totally. And so when it comes to starting solids, do you feel like, is there like one best way to do it? How do you feel about purees and baby-led weaning and all of that stuff?
Sure. So I don't like to align myself with one way of doing things, just generally in life. I think it's nice to sort of know what's available to you, peruse it, and find the one that feels like it sits best for you. So there's a couple of, well, there's probably three different types of approaches you can take. You can exclusively start with pureed foods on a spoon where you're predominantly feeding your baby. You can take a baby-led weaning approach, which is a very specific approach. It's not just giving finger foods. It's a very, very specific approach by Jill Rapley, if you want to look into that a little bit more, where you're effectively completely hands-off and anything that goes in your baby's mouth has to come from them, whether it's a spoon or self-feeding. That's baby-led weaning and that's with family meal times from day one. And then there's another approach where you can give your baby purees and you can give them finger foods alongside purees and you can feed them a bit and they can feed themselves a bit and you can just sort of do whatever you feel works for you. And all of those approaches and ways are absolutely fine. If you feel that you're going to be more confident with one over another, go for that one. If you start one or you get a sense that your baby's more keen on being independent or they're completely hands off, then you'll determine your approach from that perspective. I think probably from an advantage of all of them, they all offer different advantages and different potential disadvantages. For example, if you're doing purees, you might need to do a bit of batch cooking and prep, and that might be a disadvantage for some. If you're doing baby-led weaning, they may go really slowly and not eat very much for a while. Some people will perceive that as a disadvantage. So nothing from a health perspective, but there'll be different ones and that for each one that you may perceive to be a disadvantage, not necessarily everyone. My key approach that I say would scope all of them is that the most important thing about any approach you choose is to be responsive to your baby. So that means following their lead. So you can responsively spoon feed a baby, and I actually have got a blog on that, so we could maybe share that. And that's about being able to recognize their cues for when they want to eat and want to take another mouthful, and when they're done and when they're full, and those sorts of things. So as long as you're following your baby's lead and feeding them responsively, then I think that's the only thing I subscribe to with regards like approach or the way to do it.
Yeah. I feel the same about sleep, actually. It's not that co-sleeping is better than a cot or that cots have to be, it's actually about what works for your family, where you feel most confident, what works for your baby. Ultimately, your baby is going to obviously have a say in all of this anyway. If you've got a baby who needs contact naps or only sleep, prefers the pram or whatever, it's really stressful if you're trying to sort of fight their temperament and their personality. And I suppose, and your own as well, like if you find structure and having kind of more of an organized life and routine keeps you feeling a bit more in control, then there's no point trying to go with the flow and just do it because it's going to stress you out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've worked with families that have really been nervous to introduce finger foods and have really wanted to wait until their babies are showing them that they seem a bit more capable of being able to chew or swallow something like that because they're frightened of choking. And who am I to say to you, no, give them finger foods from day one. It's so much better. I mean, it can't be if it's going to fill you, fill you with complete fear and make the experience really, really, nervy for you. Your baby will pick up on that as well. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, and the same goes for, different approaches around what you give your baby. So there are things around, now vegetable-led weaning, where you give them loads of bitter and green vegetables. Now, if you want to do that, go for it. And there's certainly some evidence that it may reduce their likelihood of rejecting vegetables later on in life. But it's not, it's not a quick fix to stopping your baby being fussy with eating or guaranteeing that they're going to be these vegetable loving, let's post them all over Instagram because they eat, everything. Babies, it isn't that guarantee. So if you rather just give them a bit of what, the rest of you are having, and that might be, porridge, for breakfast, and that's all you start with, that's absolutely fine.
Yeah. Oh, that's so reassuring to hear, because I think it can feel a lot of early parenthood can feel competitive, like even if you're not a competitive person, and it's not even in a nasty way. You just feel a bit like you're just comparing to others, and if you've got Yeah, there's always one
Yeah.
baby, right, that's chowing down on a steak and eating spinach, and you're just there
Yeah.
trying to bargain them to have a melty puff or something.
Or even within parents, how did you do it? Like that sort of idea that
Mm.
there's a better way. And so if you never gave an Ella's pouch, or other brands are available, then,
Yeah.
then you're better than the next mum. I mean, yeah, obviously there are advantages to giving home cooked foods, lots of advantages to that. But equally, you're not a bad parent if you sometimes have given one of, something sort of bought or whatever that's appropriate for the baby's age. So, it's also that competitiveness or feeling like you've got to do the right thing for your baby all the time, because
Yeah.
that's just exhausting also. And also, we don't quite know exactly what's right, like we already spoke about,
Yeah.
when it comes to the practicalities of it.
Yeah. I suppose like any area of parenting, a lot of parenthood can feel like you're out of your depth. You don't really know what you're doing. You're learning on the job. And so sometimes if there's, for me anyway, if there's anywhere I can sort of try and exert a bit of control or get a bit kind of feel a bit more in, I don't know, learn a lot about this or feel like I've kind of got my head, it makes me feel
Yeah,
a
and
bit
be
better.
empowered.
Yeah. Which
Yeah.
sometimes is a really good thing. And sometimes it can be, you can go down a quest for perfection and it can become a bit obsessive and you can start to think, right, well, oh God, I'm a terrible parent because I gave this type of food or my baby isn't eating that type of food and so's is. So I guess it's just that balance of being kind to yourself,
Yeah,
I
and it's
guess.
about sort of, well, 100% being kind to yourself, but I'm just going to pick up on what you said about being empowered. Like, it's about trying to find somebody or a trustful source online,
Mm.
or in a book or wherever, where they're very um, able to share all the different options available to you for how to wean your infant, rather than subscribe to one or the other. Or if actually you feel that this baby-led weaning, sounds right up your street, that you go and you find out all the information about that and you make that choice. That's absolutely fine. But it's knowing what you're doing sometimes is almost like better than doing the best thing. It's just
Yeah.
finding out and then making the right choice for you.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And what would you say to someone then who has started the weaning process and their baby is maybe between 6 and 12 months and they're just not eating anything and you're just making all of these amazing things and and then just yeah, it's just really stressful.
Yeah, it's really tricky. I mean, I guess it depends where they are between sort of 6 and 12
Mm,
months. I would say if they're between 6 and 8 months, that's really, really normal. And I wouldn't over worry about it, and just make sure that the timings of your meals are good, that your baby's not too tired and not starving hungry or any of those things, and that you're sitting down with your baby and you're eating with them the same foods that they're eating, and you're happy to get messy and happy for your baby to get messy, and you sort of accept any sort of exploration or interest in meals. There's all yours as a positive and a way that they're learning how this is going to go for them. And I just wouldn't worry, at that point. Obviously, I have to say that my colleagues who are dietitians will say that we need to be mindful of the importance of the nutrients that they do get from solid foods. Um, I'm thinking about sort of multivitamins and maybe packing in some iron-rich options if they're
yeah.
breastfed, even in the earlier stages. Now, as they continue to get towards 12 months, we're sort of looking at babies starting to switch up their nutritional balance very gradually, very slowly, away a little bit further away from milk and a bit more towards solid foods. So as you know, getting towards 9 or 10 months, and they really, that poos haven't changed at all, and you're thinking, don't think they've ever swallowed anything, then I think it's time to sort of have a think about if there is anything obvious you might want to do or need to do. So if they're formula fed, you might want to look at all of the milk that they're drinking and think about whether you can more actively reduce some of the milk. If they're breastfed, you could look at the timings of when they're breastfed, and maybe see if you can put a little bit of a gap between a breastfeed and a solid meal. But I wouldn't do anything otherwise drastic around the milk feeds. And you might want to speak to your health visitor and see if they've got any general advice and all the other stuff around, giving them every opportunity to explore. I think as they approach towards 12 months and they're really not doing anything, again, arguably they may just be thriving on breast milk, and they'll get there when they get there. That doesn't necessarily mean it's problematic. Do need to think about nutrition though, and the importance of the nutrition that they might now not be getting from breast milk. There's only a tiny few things that they need from solids and how they can be getting them. And you might want to then seek more specialist advice if you're very worried. You don't have to by any means, but and that might be someone like myself, feeding specialist, who can maybe look at the whole picture of everything that's going on for your little one and start to give you some advice to help build their interest in eating, and also just to check that there's nothing physically or developmentally or sometimes from a sensory perspective that is impacting on that we're not just assuming everything's fine and they're just happy taking their milk, but there isn't something else going on that's stopping that from happening. You might want that reassurance.
Yeah, that's it. Because I think for a lot of us,
very long answer.
It's really, really good. And because I was just thinking, for a lot of us, we can really blame ourselves sometimes if things aren't going. So we think, because I gave them pears instead of broccoli to start with, and now this is it, and I'm rubbish. But actually, there could be, like you're saying, a sensory thing, or they might just be they just might be on their own path, and they just will get there. And in 2 months' time, you'll look back and go, oh, okay. Didn't need to worry.
Yeah, and I see lots of families in my clinic where they've done exactly the same thing with child number 2 than they did with child number 1. Like exactly. Yeah. And they're like, we just know it's not right, but we don't know what's wrong because by this stage my first was doing X, Y, and Z. Sometimes there is something physical, a tongue tie that hasn't been picked up, or hyperactive gag reflex because they or reflux, or something developmental that might need to be checked out. I mean, it could be anything. Equally, sometimes there's nothing at all, and they just need to be reassured, and maybe we'll tweak around, play around with milk. Maybe we will, but we never stop the milk.
Yes.
I don't know, I think that's probably worth saying. Like if you've got an 11-month-old that's not just never shown you that they've got any skills for eating, you cannot take their milk away.
Yeah.
And often I see families where that's the advice they've been given. Just cut right down on their milk.
Yeah.
You need them to show you that they can eat before you do that. So
milk, I guess, and particularly breastfeeding, I think gets blamed for a lot in general anyway, doesn't it? It's like, it's always the boob's fault.
Sometimes I say to the families that I work with, thank God for the boobs, because what would you be doing now if they didn't have all the milk? You've got these lovely babies on the 50th, 75th, 25th, whatever percentiles, thriving, following their own curve, happy as anything. That's because of breast milk, even at 9, 10, 11 months, it's sustaining them. So, I would definitely reframe that.
And how do you feel about the food under 1 is just for fun kind of mantra?
I feel like it's very present in the lactation world, but I think we know enough to know that it's not, and I'm sure lots of I shouldn't say that. I'm sure there's lots of my lactation consultant colleagues that will know also that it's not, but I think that was maybe where it came from. I don't even know where it came from, but no, the period where solids are introduced is really important, both nutritionally, because there are nutrients that they need from solid foods from 6 months onwards, but also developmentally, like it's a whole new set of skills that your baby needs to learn. And some of it's fun, exploring foods with your hands and having small tastes are great fun. But also we need to be thinking about the textures of the foods and progressing through those and helping to support what will be instinctively and naturally developing skills around tongue movement and chewing, the maturation of jaw movement for chewing. to come and to develop. So often I'll see babies 10, 11 months and they will look like they've not got chewing skills yet. But I'll explain to the families that, they've never had an opportunity to learn or practice their chewing because they've not eaten anything. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they can't, but that's another really important element to the weaning process. As is exposure to tastes as well as the textures, from a sensory point of view. So no, it should be fun, but it's not just fun.
I think there's just a lot of oversimplified phrases, like fed is best. Well, that's also a really complex thing because it's just such a short soundbite, and that's I mean, I'm sure we could talk about the fed is best motto for a long, long time, because actually what if I'm more believed in like informed or supported is best, because but all food under one is fun, and they kind of get repeated and passed around, and I suppose oversimplifying these things and not actually recognizing what might be happening, and they're not actually empowering parents at all by saying these things. It's kind of dismissing a lot of
it is, and it's also confusing to families, and not giving them the opportunity to ensure that their children are getting everything that they need, I guess. So just thinking about food before one is just for fun. So what happens, you plod along till they're 12 months and they're just having milk feeds and they've not really swallowed anything. And then what? Then you suddenly start to panic at 12 months. It's a real process where you're expecting that sort of, I talk about a seesaw, where you start the process where it's all milk and no solids. And you're just going to gradually tilt the seesaw so that as you come out of the other side of weaning, which is at 12 months, for tabletop food, but actually Jill Rapley will say close to 18 months, the lady who coined baby-led weaning, and that you should be there. So just doing nothing necessarily it isn't always, isn't ideal either. So it's tricky.
I really like that image of a seesaw, because I think too often a lot of information that we get given is about like these very these sudden development, like these sudden ages where you're like, right, at 6 months this, at 12 months this, and actually it's a process, and it's quite stressful, like you say, if you then get to that milestone and you're not there, and what does that really mean?
And what I like about the seesaw analogy is that it can tilt at different pace for different babies, so it recognizes that there isn't a standardized movement of that seesaw between, let's say, 6 and 12 months, where every baby will gradually do it like this. There will be some babies who by 7.5 months might be eating 3 meals a day and like packing them away. And then there'll be other babies who, nowhere near that 10 or 10.5 months. And both babies might be fine. So it's recognizing that diversity amongst our little people as well.
And how do you feel about the messaging that babies don't need night feeds after 6 months? What would you say to someone who'd been told that?
I just don't know where that comes from. It's just so, again, it's just like this idea that at some sort of arbitrary point in time, somebody is sort of probably one of the male pediatricians of the 1940s with no evidence to back it up in the United States. Has made some sort of arbitrary decision on 6 months or a baby's weight that just doesn't account for so much more than feeding for nutrition and feeding for comfort. And they need to be close to their mothers or parents, and the fact that sleeping through the night requires so many other things and not just a full tummy. There's so many, I don't need to tell you about it, nuanced elements to sleeping through the night. And at the end of the day, if your baby needs to wake up for a drink of anything, water or whatever, then why wouldn't you give them that if that's what they want or need? And when they're ready, they'll meet that milestone, and it will be different for different babies. And I think you'll probably know more about when the average sort of time for that to happen is, but it just makes it more confusing when you put solids in the mix. And one of my biggest sort of things is don't fix one problem with like the potential for creating another one. Like, so for example, in your mind, if you think sleep's a problem, why would you try and fix that with like food, like with, with like put pressure on a whole other developmental milestone to try and to sort of fix one? It's counterintuitive. Like every developmental milestone, I suppose, should be given its own opportunity to be achieved in the most positive way possible. And if you try and achieve one for the sake of fixing something that arguably isn't actually even broken, you're just putting a whole load of pressure on that milestone going a certain way to get to that goal. And I think that in itself is a whole stress ball of feelings and emotions. That's not going to really probably be productive for parent or baby.
Definitely. Just fighting biology is you're fighting Mother Nature. Like that just sounds like the worst fight ever. Do you know what I mean? It sounds so stressful if you're like suddenly turn that one to age, and then now you've just got to stop it. It's crazy, but it's still it's still really prevalent, that message. I see it all the time. And which is mad, because I think it really is from like the 40s of these like white American doctors just deciding that they figured it out. It's mad.
I think there's some of it in the French culture as well, because I'm sure somebody gave me a book about French babies at some point that I read, because my husband's French, and I was like, there's something called le pause. It's like a form of sleep training, I think, which I'd never really heard of. And I was like, what is this? And I read this book, and there was something about babies making their nights, and there was definitely an age to it as well. It's interesting, but I'm sure no one can ever find where these things originally came from. No idea.
No, exactly. And I suppose another thing that can stress parents out with feeding is then maybe you've established solids, you've got into the toddler stage, and then things start getting a whole new set of challenges come along with fussiness and aversions to foods and all of those things. And then that can cause, I think, with sleep as well, thinking, oh God, like my toddler really is only eating this one thing. You get worried about their nutrition. You get worried that they're not full at night, that dinner time becomes a battle. And then that bleeds into bedtime because you've then got like a hangry little person who's rejecting foods. That's a lot to deal with as well, isn't it?
That's a whole other podcast, I think.
I know, I was going to say, that's the second hour.
In a nutshell, just to write myself back, in a nutshell, absolutely. And, the first thing to say is fussiness from around 1 to 18 months is quite common and fairly normal in our little people. And one of the things that we do that is possibly making things a little bit worse is feed into our beliefs around needing to be full in order to sleep. And so that when we come to our meal times and we want to offer our children lots of opportunities to still be eating a range of foods, we either default to giving them the same stuff all the time to make sure that they actually eat and therefore sleep overnight, which in itself ends up creating a little bit more reluctance for previously accepted foods because they're seeing them less often, and exposure is really vital. Or the other thing we do, which is we think, no, I'm going to stick to my guns here, and you will have, spaghetti with sauce, with bolognese that's got carrots in it with the rest of the family and broccoli on the side. And then they have a tantrum, they don't want to eat it, and we end up making them toast with peanut butter as an alternative. And then they just end up learning that they can tantrum long enough, they'll get something else, which again creates the same situation. Like I said, sort of how do you manage that is a whole other podcast. But what I will say is I have got loads of free information about that on my blog, on my Instagram page. I've got a free download for fussy eating on my website, and I have got a really, I think, fantastic course for parents of babies from about 1 onwards, all around fussy eating, with stacks of resources, really practical things around meal planning, and how to just keep them, I guess, on track as much as possible as you navigate these years. but also how to make your meals really as stress-free as possible, and how to avoid making lots of different meals for all the different people in your family and catering to all their sort of needs. So I've got, and in it we talk about lots of things like managing throwing food off the high chair and refusing foods, and offering alternatives and going to bed hungry. We talk about that. So lots of resources if you are looking around fussy eating and introducing solids, I should say. I've got a course on that as well.
I have to say, like what you said about
my blog.
Yeah, what you said about the peanut butter toast. That is literally the scenario that I lived in for like a year and a half. And then I came across some of your free resources and your Instagram and all those things. And they are brilliant. And I was telling you before we started, but my son now, like, we're not perfect. It's fine. He's a kid. Like, it's a journey, it's a process, but we've really managed to undo some of that because and I think it's really good that I wanted to pick up on something else you mentioned, which is about timing foods, meal times when they're not too tired as well. I think that is quite important, and something I work on with a lot with families I work with one-to-one is bringing bedtime earlier and sort of having the confidence to do that, because again, I think there is this worry that we need to fill them up really close to bedtime so they'll sleep, and sometimes that can just make everything a lot harder. And so one of the first things I often change if I see a baby or a toddler who's waking a lot after bedtime, for example, is thinking, well, are they uncomfortable, or is the meal being too stressful, or why aren't they eating that dinner time that meal? And sometimes just having the confidence to say, actually, we're going to give it a couple of hours before bedtime, eating at 5 instead of 6:30 or whatever, can make a big difference for sleep, I find.
Yeah, I'm sure it can. And also, just from my perspective, just be aware of what your kids eating all day. Because often they end up that, they only need to take in a certain amount of calories in 24 hours, largely speaking, to grow. Especially like if they've been at nursery, they can often like have a nice breakfast at home, and they have snacks at nursery and early lunch. They have tea at 4 o'clock, and then you sit them down at like 5:30 with the expectation they're going to have like another dinner. And not only have they like hit all their calorie requirements for the day, broadly speaking, like they probably already had dinner at 4 o'clock. And nursery, like these tiny, in my practice, often it's these tiny little things, and I'll just be like saying to them, what do they like? Right, they like, I don't know, crackers and cheese and grapes. Why don't you give them that for dinner on a nursery day? Because invariably it looks like they have like some sort of chili con carne at 4 o'clock. Like, just give them that. And even peanut butter and jam on toast, like give them that at 5:30 and let them have a light dinner, supper, because they've probably already eaten, or whatever works for you. We when I work with families, we look at the whole day, but that sort of thing often is all that's needed.
Well, it comes back to that is what responsiveness is, isn't it? Because you and I have days where we don't need a big dinner because for whatever reason. So, but I think sometimes we have this idea that it's like, oh, I need you to have that spag bowl or that like big thing that's gonna fill you up.
Isn't it the most? I remember the day that my at the time my baby didn't eat dinner, the first time she didn't eat dinner. And I remember going to a friend's house. It happened to be a night I was going out as well.
Of course.
I remember putting her to bed, feeding her some milk, and then putting her to bed. And I spent the whole night at my friend's just panicking. My friend said to me, I bet you any money she sleeps all night. I was like, she won't. She's not had any dinner. And she's teething. I don't even know. She slept through the night. And it was the most liberating thing, because I literally was able to dismiss the whole belief that if she didn't have dinner, she wouldn't sleep through the night because she did it. And I was like, great, that's like one less thing in like the whole rest of my life that I ever have to worry about. It can happen.
I've had similar experiences where it's like, oh great, you had a bite of banana and that's it, I'm gonna have the worst night ever, and then nope, you're fine. So
nope, you're fine.
I found this conversation so reassuring, and I think people listening to it will as well, because it can be stressful with food, and like you say, it's not always that easy to find good information as well, and which is why I love all of the free resources you do. Your courses are brilliant, your webinars, your Instagram account, and I just think it's really it's a big relief, I think, to hear a lot of the things you're saying. So because sometimes there are issues and sometimes there aren't, and I think it's just about listening to your own sort of instinct as a parent, doing your due diligence, and then trusting whatever you're kind of feeling about the situation is.
100%.
Yeah.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Stacey. It's been so interesting. I find this stuff just fascinating, and yeah, I could pick your brain all day, but I will let you get on with the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me on your podcast.
Thanks, Stacey.